Hi, this is Maria Williams. In this video I'm going to show you how I made these two mermaid cards with a window that goes all the way through the card. The card on the right is the one that I made first, and it's a little bit more involved than the second one, which is the one I'm going to show in the video. So for example, I had embossed the sentiment, and I also added some glossy accents to the mermaid that I didn't add in the second card. The insides of the two cards are exactly the same. The supplies that I'm going to be using for the card are the Magical Day bundle, which is the Magical Mates framelits that go with the Magical Day stamp set. And you can get those two items separately or in the bundle. And then I use the layering squares to cut the window and the seaside embossing folder for the texture on the front of the card. I already have the pieces of cardstock for my card cut, so I have a standard card base cut out of Pool Party cardstock and a piece of Whisper White cardstock that is cut just a little bit smaller, 1/8 inch smaller on each side. So it's 4 1/8 inches by 5 3/8 inches. I also have a piece of Whisper White cardstock. It's a scrap that I'm making sure is large enough for me to cut the scalloped frame that's going on the front of the card. To cut the frame, I'm using the largest scallop square and the third largest regular square. I also have my window sheet or acetate, and then I have some it's Tranquil Tide and Old Olive. And the colors that I am using for the card are basically the colors from the Myths and Magic Specialty Designer Series paper, which coordinates with this Magical Day bundle, but I'm not using any of today. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my card base ready. So I've taken the third largest square from the layering square set, and I'm going to use a little bit of painter's tape to tape it down to the base. And I'm trying to make sure that most of my tape is on the inside of the square, just because if there's any issue with removing the tape, it will be on the square that I'm going to cut out and I'm not going to use. Once I have the front cut, I'm just taking the white panel that's going to go in the inside of my card, and I'm putting a little bit of adhesive on the area of the white panel that's going to be cut out. And this is just so that it's held in place really well as I run it through my Big Shot. I'm lining the panel perfectly inside my card base, and then I'm going to close the card and align, actually kind of slot the die into the square that I've already cut, and this will ensure that the square is cut perfectly in the same place on all my layers. Depending on the thickness of the cardstock that you're using, this may or may not cut all the way through. When I pull mine out, you'll see that some of the areas didn't cut, and part of this is because my plates are pretty bowed. I haven't been good about flipping them over every time I use them, so one of them especially is really bowed, so it didn't cut all the way through. But in this case, because it's just a simple rectangle, I'm just going to take a craft knife, and I've already got the line there, so all I've got to do is kind of stick my knife in there and run it along the line and cut it the rest of the way. And then I just remove the panel and put my die back in place and run it through my Big Shot one more time. Now that I have all my windows cut out, I'm going to move on to the embossing of the front of the card. And I wasn't entirely happy with the way my cardstock looked when I embossed it the first time, so here's a sample of what it looked like originally. And you can see that some of the edges look a little bit rough, so I decided to run some wax paper over my cardstock before I ran it through the Big Shot, and it did seem to make a difference. I originally tried to run the wax paper through the Big Shot with the cardstock, and that did not work out well because it made my cardstock tear. But if I just rubbed the cardstock with the wax paper, it seemed to put on just enough wax that when I ran it through the embossing folder, it kind of smoothed everything out. So I'm just very quickly rubbing the wax paper over the front side of my cardstock and then on the back side of this cardstock, and then I'm going to take my embossing folder and put the front of the card only into the embossing folder. I have my platform set to tab 1 and I sandwich the embossing folder and cardstock between two plates and run it through. Embossing cardstock does tend to weaken it a little bit, so this is one of the reasons why I decided to put a frame around the opening, and it's also why I chose that size opening. Originally I had done a bigger opening and it just really felt like the card was flimsy in the area of the window, so I went with a smaller square. I'm going to run the two dies through at the same time, so I'm just taking the same painter's tape that I was using before and the same square die that I was using before with the scalloped one, taping them together, and then I'm going to run it through my Big Shot. To stamp the mermaids, I used my stamp position. I'm using a MISTI. I don't have a stamparatus yet. I hope to get one as soon as the new catalog comes out. But I set the stamp in the corner so that I could stamp a couple of them on the same piece of cardstock. And I like having it in the MISTI as well because if I kind of go over the black outline of the mermaid and it's not looking really crisp, I can always put it back in the MISTI and stamp right over it. The mermaid on my original card is colored with watercolor pencils, and I use Melamambo and Early Espresso, and since there's no Pool Party watercolor pencil, I use Bermuda Bay, which I actually thought looked a little bit brighter than Pool Party would have looked. For the two mermaids I stamped today, I used Copic markers and Prismacolor pencils. Here are the Prismacolor pencils I used. I only used 5 of them, and I'll have all the numbers on my blog post. And for this one, I used Copics, and I didn't use a whole lot of colors. I didn't do much shading at all. I just used 6 different colors, including the colorless marker, which I used to fix a couple of boo-boos. And again, I'll have these colors listed on my blog as well. I decided to use the mermaid that I had colored with a Copic marker, so I used a coordinating die and cut it out. And then I want to show you how I did the seahorses. For some reason the name was escaping me just now. I already have the stamp set up in my MISTI, and I have a piece of scrap paper, and I'm going to ink it up and stamp it. So now you see that image there, and then I'm going to take a piece of cardstock that I have already die cut one of the seahorses from, and I'm going to place it perfectly lined up with the stamped image. I purposely cut the cardstock a lot larger around the edges of the seahorse so that I have plenty of room to place magnets. All I have to do now is quickly die cut 3 seahorse die cuts out of the white Whisper cardstock, and then bring them in, slot them into the space, and then ink up my stamp and stamp it down. And then I just pull them out either by lifting up the one end of the cardstock and pushing it out, or another way that I like to do it is to just take a little piece of tape and stick it onto the die cut and pull it out. I've colored my 3 little seahorses pretty quickly, and now I'm going to add some Sizzix adhesive sheet to the back of some Tranquil Tide cardstock. I have already done the same thing with a piece of Old Olive cardstock, and I'm going to use both of those pieces to cut the foliage or branches that are going at the bottom of the window. I usually like to leave a little bit of a border of cardstock around the Sizzix adhesive, especially on the sides where I'm going to be cutting. That way my scissors are not cutting through the adhesive. I'm cutting 3 of the die cuts from each one of the pieces of cardstock. There are 2 different little branches in the set, so I just randomly cut some out of each color. Besides the sentiment, I just have one more item that I need to cut, and that is the window sheet or acetate. This is kind of hard to see, but anyway, I'm using my square die as a guide to get the size, and I think it ended up being about 2 3/4 square. So I'm just using my regular paper trimmer, and it cuts really well through the window sheet. And the main challenge here is to keep track of these pieces after you've cut them. I can't tell you how many pieces of window sheet I have lost. I'm going to go ahead and assemble the card now. So I decided against my better judgment to use liquid glue. Liquid glue and I don't always get along, but it is a good way to attach window sheet. The other great way to do it would be to use fast fuse, which is what I should have done in this case. But if you prefer liquid glue, just make sure that you don't put too much on there, because remember that the window sheet does not absorb the glue at all. So I'm attaching the first piece of window sheet, and then I'm going to attach all my elements onto it. I'm using a large block placed on top of the window sheet to keep it in place, make sure that I get really good contact and that I don't mess it up while I'm handling my other elements. And unfortunately I forgot to put adhesive sheet on the back of my cardstock when I cut out the mermaid and the seahorses, so now I'm going to have to use a different kind of glue. For the original card I used the Tombow Monomulti that I have sitting there, but I decided I wanted to see if I could just press the die cuts onto the adhesive sheet and if it would kind of make it into a sticker. So I've peeled the backer off and I'm making sure that I have the right side with the adhesive on it. It seems to me that sometimes the adhesive sticks to the size that has the letters on it, and sometimes it sticks to the other side when you peel the two layers of backer apart. So I'm just taking the seahorse and I'm pressing it down and then I'm pulling it off. And it did a pretty good job, except that it sort of created almost like a string. Instead of just breaking off cleanly, it kind of acted like the fast fuse, where if you don't do the flicking motion, you kind of get that stretchy mess. But it did okay. I just kind of ran my fingernails around the edges of the seahorse and it worked out okay. For the mermaid, I actually had a little bit more adhesive that I didn't want, so I just took a paper piercer and just put it in the gaps to kind of pick up the extra adhesive, and that took care of it. So now I'm just using my original card for reference and just placing the elements where I want them. The mermaid goes down first because I want it to look like she is behind everything. And then I'm placing the seahorses and the foliage. And actually I should have done my second seahorse now, so that when I put the leaves they would be in front of the seahorse, but I kind of forgot. But it didn't matter. I was able to peel up the foliage a little bit later on and just tuck him in behind it. To add a little bit more detail to my window, I decided to add some of the little bubbles that come in the stamp set. So I'm going to use some StazOn ink that works for window sheet and all slick surfaces. You don't want to use craft ink because it just will not dry. I didn't do this on the original card, so on the video when you see it, it doesn't have the little bubbles, but then in the pictures they are there because I decided I liked it and I added them at the end. So after I had added a few, I added the second seahorse and then added a few more bubbles, and my little scene was done. So I moved on to the front of the card. I once again used liquid glue to attach the frame to the opening, and I did just use my finger to kind of spread the ink out a little bit so I wouldn't have any blobs and I wouldn't have an oozing problem, and then just placed it on the front of the card. At this point I was feeling pretty good about the liquid glue, so since it was right there I decided to use it to attach my second layer of window sheet. You could not attach this and just put the white panel on there, but I really wanted the elements to stay safe and really look like they were in the water as much as possible, even though this is a totally whimsical card. So I went ahead and pressed it down, and there went the glue inside the two layers of my window, and I see it now in the video, but I didn't realize it then until I took the block off and closed the card and took a good look. And yes, you can see it from the back as well. So I did the best I could to try to salvage the situation. I wiped it with my finger. My husband walked in and I asked him to please bring me a paper towel with a little bit of water on it. So I used that on it as well. And you could still see the mess just a little bit. So in the end, I just added the seahorse that I was going to put on the front of the card. I just added it up there in the corner. For the sentiment on the inside of the card, I just used the stamp from the stamp set that says "Hope your day is magical" and stamped it with some fresh fig ink with the aid of my Stamp-A-Majig. And for the sentiment on the outside of the card, I used fresh fig cardstock, and instead of embossing the sentiment, I just decided to stamp it with a StazOn white ink that I had on hand. I die cut it with the coordinating die from the set, and it was ready to go on my card. I attached the inside panel to the inside of my card using Fast Fuse, which is actually my favorite adhesive for my cards nowadays. And then I attached the sentiment to the front of the card using some dimensionals. My acetate window had a couple of smudges on it, so I took a small piece of paper towel that I had put some alcohol on and cleaned the window off, being careful not to get the alcohol on the cardstock. To finish the card off, I added that last seahorse with a glue dot and called it a day. And I did forget to say earlier that I did cover the mermaid with a pretty heavy coat, actually a couple of them, of Wink of Stella. So that's the finished card, and here's a look at the original card once again. As I mentioned before, I did heat emboss the sentiment with white embossing powder and put the third seahorse on the sentiment instead of on the inside of the card, but essentially the cards are the same. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up, and I hope you come back to watch another video soon. Thanks so much for watching.